Hi and welcome back to Bike Speed. So this week we're going to sort out this Scott mountain bike. As you can see from this is a well-ridden bike. We're going to be replacing the chain set and cassette, and also cleaning up the drivetrain. We're going to bleed the rear brake. We're going to replace and fit new front and rear derailleur cables. We're going to fit new headset bearings. We're going to do a little bit of work on the wheels and just generally sort this bike out and tidy it up. Now, looks aren't everything. In the instance of this bike, I could tell that this bike had actually been quite well maintained. There was a few things going on with this bike and the jockey wheels and just one or two other odds and ends that I could tell that this rider had quite a good service regime with this bike. And so we're now just going to bring it to its next level and make sure that this bike is ready to go for the miles ahead of it until maybe we service it next time. Now, one of the first problems we had with this bike was removing this cassette. It was absolutely solid, so I had to use a breaker bar and a slightly heavier chain whip on that one to get that off. It was way over tightened, but it is what it is. We're actually replacing this cassette. This cassette was very worn. The chain, as you saw me measuring there, was well stretched out, so the actual drivetrain on this bike was absolutely the end of its life. You can see here this quick release skewer was on the wrong way round. That will actually make it hard to seat the wheel in the frame. You always want the wider part, that part there, to sit in the cap of the actual quick release skewer itself, so you have the thinner end towards the wheel. See that a lot actually, where those are the wrong way around. That's a very common problem, and it's one of the primary reasons for maybe wheels not sitting correctly in a frame. You can see here from the rear derailleur how in ground this is with dirt and debris. I think this bike is well used off-road, and a lot of this is built up on this bike, but we're going to sort that rear derailleur out and clean everything up, and things like this clumped up mud here. We'll clean all these parts out. They'll all go through the ultrasonic cleaner, and once we've washed the bike down, it's going to be a different bike. You can see here this area, how clumped with mud and debris that is. That front derailleur, although it was working okay, it would have only been a matter of time before all that mud and debris would have dried that part out, and it would have eventually have seized. You can see early signs of rust in there, so we're going to get that through the ultrasonic cleaner and lubricate it up, and again that will keep that part going. Off come the chain set, very worn. We actually replaced like for like on this one because of this generation and the gearing on this bike, it was actually quite tricky to find an alternative to the one that was on there, so we actually refitted a Sunrace one on there. The back brake wasn't actuating as nicely as the front brake, so we're going to bleed the back brake through. But again, I knew that his brake pads were non-Shimano, so they've been replaced. And you can see here on these cables how rusty they are. They'd actually rusted and broken through the surface, so this bike would never have changed gear nicely, so it needed new cables. It was actually mainly the outer cables that needed. You know, often the inner cables corrode and fray and get jammed up inside the outer, and you can often reuse the outer, but in this instance the outers are completely gone on that. So these jockey wheels, they're non-Shimano, they're non-original, so at some point he's replaced those, and he's replaced them with full bearing jockey wheels. So we're going to actually remove the seals off of the bearings, because in this instance actually the old-fashioned Shimano, where you have a ceramic pivot point rotating inside the jockey wheel, they're actually better for mud and debris like he's got. So those bearings were completely full of mud, so we'll put those through the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I'll re-lubricate the bearings and put the seals back on, and those jockey wheels now will then be good for a few thousand miles more. So here we are, they've come out the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I just wash them down and before I re-lubricate them. We often get asked in the comments about our ultrasonic cleaner. We've got a 6-litre ultrasonic cleaner, and we use a water-soluble degreaser in there so that we can wash it off afterwards. So that's what's going on with our ultrasonic cleaner. We run the parts through for around about 15-20 minutes with no heat if they're anodized. We only use the heat settings if it's a chain or a cassette only, because otherwise it can discolor and fade off the anodizing, so no heat on your anodized parts. And then we take everything out, wash it through, just warm soapy water to wash off that degreaser, and just to get them really nice. We use the little detailing brushes there just to work in, scrubbing brushes, sponges, all sorts of different things we use to clean parts after they've come out the ultrasonic cleaner, because it doesn't do everything, so we just like to get that part spot on. So now I'm re-greasing these jockey wheels. They may have come with a very thin oil in there, but I actually chose the Shimano premium grease on these because of the way this bike builds up with debris. I know that that's probably likely to happen again, so we want to avoid any of that debris getting into those bearings, so we're going to use a premium grease inside those, and they'll operate perfectly fine. He won't be able to tell any difference the way this bike is used as to what grease or oil we've used on the jockey wheels alone. So now we also just lubricate the pivot points on the derailleur. We're using a nice thin oil there that will work in, and then we're just going to put a little bit of grease on the spring as well, just to stop that going rusty or building up with sort of debris that will cause it to rust or not actuate nicely. And the same process on the front derailleur, oiling on the pivot points, a little bit of grease on the springs, and also on your quick release skewers. A little bit of grease on those and a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. No harm at all in doing that. It'll stop that sticking inside the hub of the wheel. Now also with this one we had a problem with the bearings. The front headset bearings, you can just feel and see were absolutely life extinct. So we're going to remove those, and you can see here how grimy and thick they were. The steering on this bike wasn't nice at all. But actually I took these cups out. You can see here I've already took them out. These were sort of a semi-integrated headset bearing, and actually what we did was put in a cup whereby we'll now have full sealed bearings going in this. They'll just deal with the mud and debris, and the type of riding this bike is getting a little bit better. They're a little bit more hardy than those loose ball bearings in cages. So we're just greasing up that frame after cleaning it up. We're now going to press in our new cups ready for our slightly different style of bearing, the full sealed bearing. So that's what we're just doing now, is just pressing in the cups themselves. And then I do actually just put a little bit of grease around the cups to hold the bearings, but also clean down this steerer tube, a little bit of wire wool, a little bit of degreaser, just so that I know that's going to go smoothly into the new bearings, and that the spacers are also going to go smoothly onto that steerer tube. So you can see there, just a little bit of grease to hold the bearings in, just sort of makes my job easier, and that can actually stop some of the little creaking noises you get just by lubricating those, so they can sit nicely into their cups. So now go the spacers and everything else ready for the handlebars to go back on, and then the cap back on, and then we just tighten up the stem itself. But I only ever do all these parts, you'll see as I go through this bike, I put them on pinch tight, and then I can do any adjustments that's necessary along the way, and those handlebars are spot on. So clean up the pads. Again, these aren't Shimano pads, so again it tells me this bike has been well maintained throughout its life and usage. So I'll just skim those off. The reason I skim those off is because they get scored, they get little lines of debris and impregnated with greases and things from the road, and if I skim them off I just take away some of that potential for squealing. And the same with the disc here. I wipe it down with a bit of brake cleaner, then a little bit of emery cloth going around the disc just to get rid of those score lines, just to stop that potential of squealing on the pads. And that's the way that I stop squealing. This is the #1 reason for brake squealing on discs, is those discs scoring away. Clean up the hub itself. I felt the bearings. I see in comments sometimes saying we didn't do this bearing, we didn't do that bearing. What you have to remember is that these bikes are filmed over 2 or 3 days, and we've already fully assessed the bike before we film it, and we've already checked the bearings and know that they're okay. So you don't always get to see every part of the job on camera, but there's a lot more goes on to these ones that we video than sometimes meets the eye in terms of what we do. We can't have a bike that we're filming that's too involved, because it would take too long. Likewise, we like to present you a bike that has got a little bit of extra work, something a little bit unusual about it, so that it's entertaining for yourselves. So if you are new to the channel, do subscribe. If you're already subscribed, thank you very much. We thoroughly enjoy the interactions with you all, and they're coming daily now, and we really enjoy chatting to you all. So do drop a comment. So what I'm going to do here, this is one of our #1 pet hates, is logos not lining up with valves. So I'm going to turn that tyre on the wheel to line up the logo of the tyre with the valve hole itself. It's actually good practice, because you can also tell where a puncture is by the logo itself. So if you put your inner tube into water and you find a bubble bubbling out, you can locate it on the tyre. And likewise, if you had a problem with maybe a puncture coming along twice, maybe in 2 rides, you know whether it's in the same place or not. The other issue we had with this bike was the rear brake wasn't actuating as firmly as the front brake. It needed bleeding out, so that's what we're going to do here. But rather than just bleeding out any air, it's actually just as easy to replace the entire brake fluid within that system. Then you know you've got new. So you can see the brown discolorated brake fluid coming out there, and you can see that tube gradually going green as the new comes through. So I now know that I've got a full brake system of new fluid in there, so I can lock that off, check the front brake, get out any air in there, and then we can tighten everything up and make sure it's all okay and clean. So just a little bit of brake cleaner on there to take any debris off, and then I now know that brake is working spot on. And now the most joyful part of this job was washing this frame down, because it was pretty dirty. So it was quite enjoyable just to see the blacks and the greens come through on this bike as we were washing it down. So we're using the big softy brush there and a little bit of wire wool on the stanchions just to get that surface rust off that was forming mainly on this one here that I'm now cleaning. The other one wasn't too bad, but just clean off the rust that's forming on there with a little bit of wire wool, and then wash down. Even things like mud guards are actually quite hard to clean when the wheels are on, so it's nice to get the wheels off and to really wash the frame down like this, and you can see that debris and dirt just coming off of there. Lovely. We've got that lovely soft nylon brush, and it just brings the frames up lovely when we do them. So that's what we're now doing, just washing it down, and then we can start the process of getting this bike back together. Once we've done this, we'll dry it all off with a microfiber towel. We always use a fresh microfiber towel on the paintwork, which is what I've got there. Microfiber towels are great because one, they're soft, and two, they will draw out the dirt and debris, and you can really get a bike to pop out. And now we can think about putting it back together. A little bit of grease on that bottom bracket. I prefer to use grease because it stops the parts corroding together in the future. It makes future servicing easier. You can draw the chain set off of the bottom bracket a lot easier if it's been greased, and it will make no difference to the part or the contact. Providing you torque it up, everything's fine there. Generally I go through a bike afterwards with the torque wrench, but the chain set I always torque when I build the bike, because obviously that pulls it in to its final position for adjusting the front derailleur. So that's why I torque up the chain set. But the pedals we just put on loosely before we'll torque those up in our final stages. The same with this front derailleur, that goes on the bike, all just pinched tight, so that if we need to move it or adjust it we can. But again, I torque the derailleur hanger because obviously once the wheel's in, that's not easy to torque, but the rest is all done with pinch tight feel, and then I torque up the bike once I've finished. So on go the new front and rear derailleur cables with the new outers, so that that's absolutely performing at its actual best. Now you'll notice here that I'm putting new clips onto this rear cable. There was probably at some point in its life the rear one must have been missing, although it was actually on there when the bike came in. I think the rear one had come off, and that cable was rubbing against the frame there, so it would have been coming up here, kinking off to the derailleur and rubbing away on the frame. But at some point a clip had been put on. But I'm just going to cover that damage just with a little bit of vinyl, just to take your eye off it. A little bit of matte vinyl there. That will also, if it ever happens again when that clip comes off, will just protect that frame and just stop that paint getting any worse. So it's just one of the details that we sort of thing that we like to do when we're servicing bikes. Just take your eye off of damage and just detail the bike up if we can. So that's what we were doing there. So we now sort out the cables, get everything on, and now we can begin to just adjust things. So I just pulled that up to the top ring so that I could nip off the cable, and then we just check our adjustments, and now we can just put the brake pads back on. A little bit of anti-seize grease on the back of the pads. In this instance, the pistons on this bike were metal, so there's potential for those to rust against the pads and spoil the braking. So that's a very minimal amount of grease I put on there. It won't impregnate the seals, it won't impregnate the pads, but it may just stop the pistons sticking and rusting to the pads in future. So that's why I do those there. On go the wheels now. We've got the new cassette and the discs all cleaned up, the tyres all turned, new chain. So this is really beginning to, you can see the difference beginning to pop out at us and starting to look very, very nice indeed. A few adjustments along the way. So I'll adjust the rear derailleur, I'll adjust the front derailleur, adjust the brakes and their actuation points so that the discs are in the centre of the calipers. So just making sure at this stage that everything's right, test the brakes, test the gears, and then I know that everything there is absolutely spot on, pulling and stopping as it should be, changing gear as it should. And then I can run through the torque wrench. So I go through all the nuts and bolts that I can get to. So we're doing stems, shifters, brake levers. So we sort of do the front end first, we'll do the front calipers. So we'll literally do the front forks and front end first, then we'll do the middle section. So we're talking front derailleur, pedals, chain sets, seat posts, seat clamps, all these things on the central point. And then we move to the back where we'll then do the back brake. You can see I've got an extended Allen key there into a socket because that clears the triangle of the frame. So then I'll do the rear derailleur and all those parts before I'll also just check the frame fittings themselves. A little bit of silicone grease on stanchions just to stop those go, or help to stop those go rusty in the future. And you can see here what a massive difference we've made to this bike. It's now absolutely spot on, lovely and clean, new cables, all the gears sorted out, all the brakes sorted out, everything working as it should. Absolutely ready to do thousands of miles again before it will need servicing, and I know from this customer's service regime that this bike will be coming back to us in due course. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Do like, subscribe and hit the notification bell, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.